few weeks ago, when I was discussing the financial crises of 18th century France, I said this: the calling of the Estates General opened the door to the revolution. How did a fiscal crisis turn into a political revolution? That's the question of this video. In this video, we're going to look at what went down at the Estates General in 1789 and how the official revolution began. Okay, let's get going. For this lesson, you're going to need something to take notes with and one primary source, a pamphlet from the Abbé Sieyès called What is the Third Estate? Let's pick up where we left off. France was in a massive financial crisis. Social stability was weakening. The politics of the moment were becoming contested and cultural bonds were deteriorating. This was the situation of France in the 1780s. The best place to start the story is with the failed meeting of the Assembly of Notables in 1787. Remember that this was the idea of the finance minister at the time, Charles-Alexandre de Calonne, to totally reinvent the financial system of France. He planned to abolish all existing taxes and replace them with a universal tax that would apply to all people, even the clergy. He called for new short-term loans to help the monarchy pay its immediate bills, and he argued once again for an opening up of the grain trade. Remember also that the financial situation that Calonne inherited was terrible. The annual deficit in 1786 was upwards of 112 million livres, which amounted to 25% of the monarchy's total annual income. And almost 50% of the monarchy's total annual income was going to just servicing the interest on the royal debt. To make matters worse, the third vingtième tax was set to expire at the end of the year, so the situation was bad, really bad. And something had to happen. Well, you remember what happened at the Assembly of Notables. Negotiations stalled out in March 1787, and by April, the ministry was ready to declare defeat. As a result, Calonne was sacked and replaced by another finance minister, Loménie de Brienne. With the new finance minister in charge, a call went out from many segments of society to convoke the Estates General for the first time since 1614. Nobles and members of the Third Estate alike believed that the only institution that could do the work and help solve the massive quagmire that was the financial crisis of the monarchy was the Estates General. Even the parlements got on board. When Brienne went to the Parlement of Paris requesting another round of loans, the magistrates refused to approve of the financial measures unless Brienne agreed to a meeting of the Estates General. And out of desperation, Brienne and Louis XVI agreed. Now, the original plan was for the Estates General to meet in 1792. Brienne thought that the chances were that he could find some way to actually avoid going through with it in the 5 years that he had until the proposed event. It was a bluff, right? Brienne thought by agreeing he had bought himself some time to actually devise a plan that would fix things without invoking the dreaded idea of popular sovereignty in the Estates General. But nature, however, did not comply. On July 13th, 1788, there was a freak and epic hailstorm that rocked France. Contemporaries claimed that hailstones were so large they were killing men and animals by the hundreds. The hailstorm devastated hundreds of square miles of crops, and as William Doyle has explained, it was right on the eve of the harvest. Besides the food crisis that would come from another crop failure, France had just suffered one a few years before, there was also a fiscal crisis that came with it. You see, tax officials set the rates of the tithe based on estimations of what the crop yield would be. And when the hailstorm decimated French crops, officials massively lowered the tithe amounts in most areas of France, meaning that the royal income through the tithe plummeted. This messed up Brienne's plans. For now, he once again needed emergency funds to keep the government afloat. And when he went back to the parliaments to get it, he was forced to agree to the meeting of the Estates General once again, and this time in 1789, and not 1792. The blunder and embarrassment of going back to the parlements hat in hand once again cost Brienne his job. Finance ministers didn't last very long under Louis XVI, And on his way out, Brienne made one final recommendation. The situation was such, he argued, that only one man would be suitable for repairing the French economy and restoring faith in the monarchy. None other than Jacques Necker. Despite the fact that the king still hated Necker, he agreed to hire him back as the finance minister once again in August 1788. Necker's return was praised throughout France. The hero of the people had returned to save France from its demise. Upon returning to office, Necker made two formal declarations. First, he assured France that the Estates General would meet in 1789, just as promised. And second, he declared that in light of the devastating crop failure, it would be the responsibility of the government to make sure that everyone in France had enough bread to survive. These were bold statements that brought popular acclaim, but also put the government on the hook for some big actions. So the Estates General was set to meet in the spring of 1789. And in advance of the meeting of the Estates General, the monarchy loosened censorship restrictions so that people were able to print and voice their opinions about how the meeting should go. What followed was a wave of pamphlets, a whole pamphlet debate in which people argued different political realities about France and argued about what the Estates General should be. And among the many pamphlets that were published in the months before the Estates General, one stood out, and it was Emmanuel Joseph Siège's What is the Third Estate? So at this point, I want you to pause the video and I want you to read this document and pay attention to what Siège is arguing not only about society and politics in France, but about what he feels the Third Estate truly is. The whole pamphlet is really provocative, and there are a lot of pieces of it that we'll talk about in class, but I want to draw your attention to one paragraph. Check out what Siège says here. Who then shall dare to say that the Third Estate has not within itself all that is necessary for the formation of a complete nation? It is the strong and robust man who has one arm still shackled. If the privileged order should be abolished, the nation would be nothing less, but actually something more. Therefore, what is the Third Estate? Everything. But in everything shackled and oppressed. What would it be without the privileged order? Everything. But in everything free and flourishing. Nothing can succeed without it. Everything would be infinitely better without the others. This is the heart of Siège's main argument. For him, the Third Estate is not a part of the nation, it is the nation. And we'll see these ideas borne out in just a bit. To make the Estates General happen, constituencies throughout France had to select representatives, 2 representatives from each estate from each district of France. And the choice of who to select and who got selected as representatives to the Estates General helps make sense of what went down when they finally came together in May of 1789. The election process began in January 1789. We remember, however, that the various estates had a significant amount of variety within them. The estates were not cohesive wholes, so the question is, who won the right to serve as a representative? The results of these assemblies were not necessarily what one might expect. In the first estate, parish priests were overwhelmingly selected to serve as representatives. Some 75% of the 303 clerical representatives were from the lower clergy. Only 46 bishops served as delegates to the Estates General. In the second estate, the results were mixed. But the 2 largest groups were members of the bonne noblesse, or the high nobility of the court, who made up around a third of the noble delegates, and the country nobility, who made up much of the rest. Robe nobles only managed to place 22 delegates into the Estates General, and this is a reminder of just how much many members of the aristocracy despised nobility of the robe. For the Third Estate, no peasants or artisans made it to the Estates General. Deputies were expected to pay their own way, so the poor were largely excluded. The most common delegates were members of the bourgeoisie, and especially lawyers. It was the literate, educated members of the Third Estate that made their way to Versailles to represent much of the nation. There was, however, one major issue that came up in the pre-revolutionary pamphlet debates and plagued the early days and weeks of the Estates General. And to understand this issue a little better, we're going to go to Daniel Watkins, Esquire, Attorney at Law. Watkins, Esquire? Hello there, I'm Daniel Watkins, Esquire, attorney at law. My clients in the Third Estate of France and I have filed an amicus brief to issue a wrongful grievance charge at the monarchy in France. You see, the Estates General, as it met in 1614, was fundamentally unequal to the members of the Third Estate. Voting in the Estates General happened by order, which meant that each estate only got one vote. And the first two estates always seemed to vote together, much to the demise of my clients in the Third Estate. Secondly, the Estates General in 1614 always deliberated separately in each chamber of the estates, so that discussion was not had in common, but rather separately among the members of each estate. My clients in the Third Estate protested this arrangement at the beginning of the Estates General meeting in 1789. They called for voting by head, which would allow every single representative one vote and deliberation to happen in common. But the king refused our plea and unfortunately overruled our objection. He allowed us to double the members of the Third Estate representatives, but he maintained voting by order. This was an unacceptable situation and circumstance for the members of my clients, the Third Estate. The decision to double the representatives from the Third Estate, but to maintain voting by order, was incredibly important. It set up the conflict that would completely transform the Estates General in the summer of 1789. The first session of the new Estates General met on May 5th, 1789. The three estates, garbed in their traditional outfits, proceeded to a large hall in Versailles and heard speeches from the king's ministers, including Jacques Necker, who gave a 3.5-hour-long speech on the state of the monarchy's finances. You'd think my lectures are long. The speech was so long that Necker himself lost his voice in the middle of it and couldn't even finish it, passing it off to one of his associates to complete. Those attending complained that it was never-ending. An inauspicious start. The first order of business was to verify all of the delegates. Remember that this is the 18th century. There are no photo IDs or social security cards or anything like that. The Estates General had to ensure that those who showed up in Versailles were the people that were elected to be representatives. This process was to take place in each estate's separate chambers. A collection of delegates from the provinces of Dauphiné and Brittany, however, objected to the process. They explained that separate verification would inevitably lead to separate voting, and that the Third Estate could not allow voting by order, as was the tradition. If they were to have any role in the Estates General, there had to be common voting by head. To force the monarchy to comply, they suggested that the Third Estate refuse to register themselves unless they could do so in common with all the rest of the delegates from the first two estates. The boycott of registration ground the Estates General to a halt. Nothing got done for weeks. The Third Estate invited the members of the first two estates to join them in common verification, but the first two estates refused, citing tradition and precedence. On June 10th, over a month after the Estates General's first session, the Third Estate still hadn't verified its members, and the first two estates wouldn't budge. So a delegate from the Third Estate, none other than the Abbé Sieyès, yes, a clergyman, but someone who ran for a representative in the Third Estate, proposed to his fellow representatives that the delegates of the Third Estate proceed with the work of the nation themselves, without consulting with the other two estates. Voting by head within the chambers of the Third Estate, the motion carried 493 to 41. The Third Estate then sent a message to the other two estates. And the message went as such: "The gentlemen of the commons invite the gentlemen of the clergy and nobility in the name of the God of peace and for the national interest to meet them in their hall and consult upon the means of bringing about concord, which is so vital at this moment for the public welfare." Initially, the other estates didn't budge. Remember that what the Third Estate was calling for was completely against precedent. Estates were supposed to meet separately, deliberate only on those things that the king told them to deliberate on, and vote in common, so the other estates refused to comply. That is, until June 13th. On June 13th, 3 representatives from the First Estate, parish priests from the city of Poitou, showed up in the hall of the Third Estate and asked to register in common with them. There was ecstatic applause in the chamber. At last! Movement! In the following days, more members of the First Estate, entirely parish priests who clearly saw more eye to eye with the perspectives of the Third Estate than their fellow members in the clergy, broke ranks. Because the Third Estate was now a collection of commoners and members of the clergy, on June 17th, Sieyès once again made a motion, this time to change the name of their body from the representatives of the Third Estate to the National Assembly. The motion approved, again, overwhelmingly, 491 to 89. Sieyès' vision of the Third Estate as the nation was coming to life. 2 days later, the Third Estate scored another major victory. The remaining members of the First Estate deliberated and narrowly decided to join the Third Estate in their entirety. When the decision was announced, a parish priest leaned out of the windows of the hall and shouted, "Gagné, gagné," or we won, to the delight of the populace outside. The National Assembly was now comprised of the entirety of the First and Third Estates delegations. Now remember that at this point, almost 2 months had gone by and literally nothing had happened in the Estates General. In the midst of this, the king's son had died on June 4th, and so the king had been largely out of touch with what was going on. When he returned to the halls of the Estates General on June 20th, however, he was furious that no progress had been made. He called for another joint session of the Estates General where he would address the delegates himself and admonish them for their lack of action. In the meantime, he declared that no delegates could meet. When the members of the National Assembly, brazenly disobeying the king's decree, proceeded to their normal meeting place on June 20th, they found the hall locked. Determined, however, they proceeded to a nearby tennis court, where they made a famous and incredibly important declaration. Piled together inside of the tennis court, the members of the National Assembly took an oath. And it read, "The National Assembly, whereas it is called on to lay down the Constitution of the kingdom, implement the regeneration of public order, and maintain the true principles of the monarchy, can be stopped by nothing from continuing its deliberations in whatever place it may be obliged to establish itself. And that finally, anywhere its members are gathered together, that is the National Assembly. It is decided that all the members of this assembly will now swear a solemn oath never to separate, and to gather together anywhere that circumstances demand, until the Constitution of the kingdom is established and consolidated on solid foundations, and that the said oath being sworn, each and every one of the members will confirm this unshakable resolution with their signature." The declaration was truly revolutionary. The assembly declared that they would not stop meeting, and that their prerogative was, in fact, to compose a constitution for France and care for the public order. And they vowed not to return to their ordinary composition as separate estates, but to always assemble as the National Assembly. Quite the throwdown. Well, our story ends with how the king chose to respond. On June 23rd, the joint meeting of the Estates General that the king called for met in Versailles. The king proceeded to the front of the room and addressed the assembled delegates. You're going to read the declaration of Louis XVI in class, but suffice it to say that the king was not pleased. He demanded that the delegates return to their respective chambers, verify themselves, and meet as had been agreed upon in the traditional forms of 1614. He said a bunch more stuff too, but we'll leave that for class. Then he left the delegates to return to their respective chambers. The members of the National Assembly were not pleased with the king's address. They had just sworn an oath never to meet separately again. Lingering in the large hall, they began to discuss what they would do. And then a leader of the Third Estate's delegates, ironically a nobleman who had run as a representative of the Third, Honoré Gabriel de Mirabeau, stood up and addressed his fellow delegates. "We are being dictated to in an insulting manner," Mirabeau pronounced to the National Assembly. "I demand that you assume your legislative power and adhere to the faith of your oath. It allows us to disband only after we have made a constitution." And with all the commotion from Mirabeau's speech, the Master of Ceremonies, one of the king's agents, came back into the room and reminded the delegates that the king had told them to go home, right? To go back to their respective chambers. And to which Mirabeau apparently replied, "Go tell your master that we are here by the will of the people, and that we shall not stir from our seats unless forced to by bayonets." Now, the next part of the story is a bit fuzzy. We don't know exactly what happened. According to some, the Master of Ceremonies quickly found the king and told him what Mirabeau had threatened. He said, "What now?" responded the king, or something like that. And the king deliberated over what to do next. But flummoxed, some accounts say that the king just subsequently gave in. "Damn it, well, just let them stay," the king was recorded to have said. Other accounts say that the king was persuaded by Necker to comply. And others say that the king actually ordered troops to drive the National Assembly out, but by that time the assembly had already dismissed for the end of the day. Whatever the particular story, the fact remains that Louis XVI did not drive out the members of the National Assembly. Instead, he allowed them to continue to exist. The king's lack of action sent a subtle message to the members of the Second Estate. and in the days that followed, dozens crossed over and joined the National Assembly. Finally, on June 27th, 1 week after the tennis court oath, the king capitulated. He ordered that all members of the first two estates meet with the third estate, and that all deliberations and voting happen in common. What happened in May and June of 1789 was truly a revolution. The Estates General transformed into the National Assembly and became France's first true legislative body. And the tennis court oath set the agenda for that body. They weren't concerned with simply tinkering with the financial systems of France. They were interested in remaking the entire political state. Somehow or another, a fiscal crisis had birthed a political revolution. And the story that follows shows how members of the National Assembly and others transformed the political state of France over the course of the next few years. This was the beginning of the official revolution. Okay, that's it for this video. Good job. Don't forget to bring your notes to class with you. Keep working hard, keep doing the readings, and I'll see you soon.